I would like to talk about Mr. Darcy's pride and the shy person's dilemma. Because I feel like a lot of shy people face the same problem that Mr. Darcy does, and it really gets at the deep themes of the book. And yes, there will be spoilers in this video, just so that you know. But the basic setup is that Mr. Darcy is shy. And he comes into a town and he's sort of too shy to interact with the town, and they're really offended by that. In fact, they attribute that to his pride and essentially to his looking down on them. Now, we're going to actually have to flesh that out because that doesn't exactly fit with the definition of pride that Mary Bennet is going to give a few chapters after this ball scene in the book. But we will flesh that out and we will make those connections. And as a result of Mr. Darcy offending everyone, including and especially Elizabeth, he sort of turns people against them, such that Elizabeth and everybody else kind of interprets all of his behavior for many, many months in light of their initial dislike and their initial sort of ungenerous interpretation of his shyness toward them. And a lot of shy people have experienced other people interpreting their behavior as being judgmental toward them, as being condescending, as being standoffish. And this creates almost this self-fulfilling prophecy with some of the things that can go on with shy people. Now, Elizabeth has a critique of this shyness, and she sort of views it as his duty to interact with people, to sort of show them that they are worth pleasing. And we're actually going to look at the word pleasing and the way it's used in the chapters around the ball, where Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth first meet. Because that word pleasing, does convey that actually these social nuances and the social conventions convey to other people that they are worthy of being pleased, and that not fulfilling those social conventions conveys to people they are not worthy of being pleased. In other words, it's interpreted as a judgment on them. And Elizabeth's critique, even after she's gotten to know him a little bit, is that he's not trying. He's not even putting forth any effort to try to convey to people that he values them in any way. And she actually compares this with playing the piano, how you have to practice to get good at it, and he's not putting forth the effort to practice. It's a perhaps partially legitimate critique on her part, even though it's also incredibly prejudiced. Now, I would contend that the characters Mr. Darcy, Mr. Collins, and Mr. Bingley all show different relationships with this social dynamic, social pleasing of other people phenomenon, where Elizabeth's telling Mr. Darcy he needs to practice more, he needs to essentially develop his taste in treating other people with the respect that she thinks they deserve. And Mr. Collins is the other end of the spectrum. Mr. Collins actually delights in these social conventions that are meant to show people respect. But of course, he takes it over the top. People kind of know that Mr. Collins' gestures of respect are more about his delight in the process of showing people respect and that reciprocal dance, rather than an actual genuine respect inspired by his view of them being worthy. So he's taking it to the other extreme. And of course, Mr. Bingley is perfect. He's right in the middle. He can walk into a party and initially know all the principal people in the room somehow, figure out who's important to introduce himself to. He wins everybody over by saying the right things and showing them the attention that they feel they deserve. Now, of course, with Mr. Bingley, even though he's sort of at the sweet spot, the perfect spot on this spectrum, that's actually also his downfall, because of course when you engage in this active reciprocal pleasing of other people, sometimes you're more easily influenced by them through that process. And especially if that's an authentic exchange, like it is with Mr. Bingley, that by engaging in this pleasing and being pleased, you are influenced by them. And that influence for Mr. Bingley almost separates him from the woman he loves. So what she's doing with these three characters is just so delicious when you dig into it. Now, I would like to actually go through some of the text to convince you that this interpretation is a reasonable way of understanding what's going on. And the first thing I would like to put forward is that Mr. Darcy is in fact shy. So of course we have the ball scene and Mr. Bingley is out there being charismatic and introducing himself. And Mr. Darcy is walking around and he's only talking to people he already knows. Anyone who tries to talk to them, he kind of shudders a little bit and looks angry, and we'll see that in a second. But the situation is such that there's not enough gentlemen for dancing, and there's lots of young ladies who would like to dance. So Mr. Bingley tries to encourage Mr. Darcy to get involved. And let's see what they say. Mr. Bingley says, "Come, Darcy, I must have you dance." Mr. Darcy says, "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner." So Mr. Darcy is just not comfortable with strangers. And in a passage a few pages later, it says about Mr. Darcy, he was haughty, reserved, and fastidious. His manners, though well-bred, were not inviting. Mr. Darcy was continually giving offense. And I had to look up the word fastidious. Fastidious means difficult to please, exacting, or excessively scrupulous or sensitive. And then I looked up haughty, even though I had a general sense of what it meant. And it says scornfully condescending or proud. And one thing about Mr. Darcy's shyness is that he is the main victim of his shyness. For example, he sets Elizabeth dead set against him. Even though he falls in love with her, she's just completely not open to him because of the way he acted in this shy first evening. There's also an interesting element that has to do with status. So Mr. Darcy is very rich and very good looking, and whenever he walks into a room, people immediately notice him. And because he is so high status, people vie for his attention. Like, attention from him is more important to people and more talked about among people than others. So for shy people to have that much attention on them all the time can be an incredibly overwhelming thing. And especially when you try to give a few people attention, just like you owe them attention and you're trying to be nice, but more people come in and you can never fulfill the hunger for your attention, so why even try if it's so overwhelming for you? And I think that gets heightened when you are naturally the center of attention like Mr. Darcy is. Now, I would like to set up the nature of the shy person's dilemma, because this arises out of human nature and the way social conventions are meant to smooth something that is a natural human insecurity. Most people, if not all people, are sensitive to people's like and dislike of themselves. Like, in some ways, there's part of people's brains that are constantly scanning the room, asking the question, do people like me? Do people accept me? Am I of value to other people? Am I worthy of being pleased by other people in the group? And social convention smooths that by showing people what kind of attention and what kind of respect and what kind of social graces do you owe people, to show them that yes, you are in fact well-liked, you are valued, you are accepted by us as a community. And people tend to use that as the baseline, such that if they're not getting the attention or the respect that is due to them according to social conventions, they will interpret that as other people not thinking they are worthy of respect, worthy of being pleased. Now, I want to make the case for this by looking at the word pleasing and pleased in a variety of passages right around this first ball in the book. And the argument I'm making is that social convention really is about conveying to people that you believe they are worthy of being pleased. And of course, this is a reciprocal thing, that it goes back and forth between people through social convention. And I'd like to start by looking at a passage right after the ball and something Mrs. Bennet says as they're talking about Mr. Darcy's rude behavior. Mrs. Bennet says, "But I can assure you that Lizzie does not lose much by not suiting his fancy. For he is a most disagreeable, horrid man, not at all worth pleasing." So here's this notion of worthy of being pleased. And of course, Mrs. Bennet is saying that Mr. Darcy is not worth pleasing because he has conveyed to them, intentionally or otherwise, that they are not worth pleasing. And in particular, Elizabeth Bennet was not worth pleasing at the ball. We also see this word pleased when Mr. Darcy first shows up in the ballroom and is introduced to the townspeople. So let's read that passage. Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. He was looked at with great admiration for about half of the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity. For he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased. So above being pleased here is conveying the fact that he's not engaging in this reciprocal process of pleasing and being pleased. He believes himself above that. Or at least that's what the townspeople are interpreting from Mr. Darcy's shy behavior. We also see here that the townspeople are interpreting him as being above his company, like he's looking down on them. This is part of the shy person's dilemma. It's that when they don't interact, people interpret that as being about them. So this is another thing about human nature that plays into the shy person's dilemma. It's that people tend to interpret the behavior of everyone around them as being in response to themselves. So even though the shy person may be shy because they're feeling anxious or they don't have a lot of practice interacting socially, it may have to do entirely with themselves for the shy person. But those around them will interpret that shyness as being about them, as being a judgment on the people around them, as not being worthy of interaction. And we saw in this passage we just read that it's Mr. Darcy's behavior that has caused people to interpret him in this way. So what exactly is the behavior that's evoking this response? Well, let's read. Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening walking about the room, speaking occasionally to one of his own party. So he's only speaking to people he already knows. He's shy. And we see from this passage, of course, that everybody is judging Mr. Darcy. Everybody's looking at Mr. Darcy. It's the kind of attention that shy people can sometimes crumble underneath. Now, there can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy with shy people because they don't interact because they're sort of, in some cases, fearful that they're not going to do it right or that they don't have the skills to interact, as Mr. Darcy claims later in the book. But then by not interacting, their skills in that actually diminish, and people interpret their behavior as being judgmental, and that leaves people to withdraw from them, to stay away from them, and even to judge them more than they would if the shy person were to just interact. So the thing they're afraid of, which is oftentimes failure in the social realm, rejection in the social realm, those things actually become way more likely when they withdraw and are actually shy and not interacting. So this can turn into a spiral oftentimes for shy people. Now, of course, the consequences of that rest mostly on the shy people themselves. Like, the victim of their shyness is usually themselves, even more so than the people who momentarily feel a little bit rejected and a little bit looked down upon by their shyness. And of course, we see with Mr. Darcy, his shyness turns Elizabeth away from him. It turns the woman he eventually falls in love with against him from the start, such that she can no longer even think of him as a worthy person. Now, the word pride is attached to people's interpretation of Mr. Darcy's behavior in this passage. And pride, of course, is in the title of the book, so it's worth looking into a little bit more. And I think one of the most telling passages happens the day after the ball, or maybe it's 2 days later, when the Miss Bennets go and visit their friends, the Miss Lucases, to talk about the ball. And one of their friends, Charlotte, says, "Mr. Darcy is not so worth listening to as his friend. Poor Eliza, to be only just tolerable." So not worth listening to. Once again, we have this notion of worthy of being pleased, like worthy of being paid attention to. And because Mr. Darcy has conveyed to other people that he doesn't think they are worth interacting with, other people's reaction is he's not worth interacting with. That's come from Mrs. Bennet, and it's also coming here from Charlotte Lucas. But let's continue in the passage. Mrs. Bennet says in response to Charlotte, "I beg that you will not put into Lizzie's head to be vexed by his ill treatment. For he is such a disagreeable man that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him. Mrs. Long told me last night that he sat close to her for half an hour without once opening his lips." Now she mentions Mr. Darcy's ill treatment of Elizabeth, so we're going to look at that in a minute, but let's continue this passage. Jane defends Mr. Darcy regarding Mrs. Long. She says, "Are you quite sure, ma'am? Is not there a little mistake? I certainly saw Mr. Darcy speaking to her." And Mrs. Bennet says, "Yeah, because she asked him how he liked Netherfield, and he could not help but answering her. But she said he seemed very angry at being spoken to." And Jane once again defends Mr. Darcy, saying, "Miss Bingley told me that he never speaks much unless among his intimate acquaintance. With them he is remarkably agreeable." And Mrs. Bennet says, "I do not believe a word of it, my dear. If he had been so very agreeable, he would have talked to Mrs. Long. But I can guess how it was. Everybody said that he is ate up with pride. And I dare say he heard somehow that Mrs. Long does not keep a carriage." So here, once again, people are projecting their interpretation of Mr. Darcy's shyness. And of course, they're offended by him not being willing to interact with them and not being willing to speak to Mrs. Long, or looking kind of angry when he spoke to her and, withdrawing into himself. That's a judgment on Mrs. Long, or at least that's how the community interprets it. And they come up with, why would he judge someone as wonderful as Mrs. Long? Well, they're projecting onto him that he's judging her based on how much money she has. They think he's looking down on her because she doesn't have enough money to keep a carriage. Let's continue, because this passage is where we get into pride. Charlotte says, "His pride does not offend me so much as pride often does, because there is an excuse for it. One cannot wonder that so very fine a young man, with family, fortune, everything in his favor, should think highly of himself. If I may so express it, he has a right to be proud." And Elizabeth says, "That is very true, and I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine." So she's interpreting his shyness as being a judgment on her, as being a slight to her value as a person, to her worthiness of being interacted with or being pleased. Now here's where Mary Bennet comes in and defines pride for us. And Mary is Elizabeth's bookish sister, who isn't necessarily super wise in the ways of the world, but she reads a lot and philosophizes. So this is what she says. "Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us." And clearly Mr. Darcy is not vain, because he just doesn't care what people think about him. He's not thinking about that. So we've ruled out vanity for Mr. Darcy. Pride has to do with what you think of yourself. But actually what's really going on here, it's not just what he thinks of himself, it's the judgment that he's projecting onto others. Now, of course, the way they're all framing it is he thinks he's so high, like he thinks he's so good, that he doesn't have to put forth the effort to make other people feel valued and respected. That's sort of their interpretation. But that's not just about his view of himself. It's about his view of others as it relates to him. Now, I would like to look at the initial interaction between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, because of course, this is a central moment in the book that sets up all of Elizabeth's prejudice towards him afterwards. So I would like to ask the question, is Mr. Darcy doing anything wrong here? Or is he just being shy? Like, how do we interpret the initial interaction? And it's the same passage we started to set up before, where there's not enough gentlemen, some of the ladies have to sit down, whereas they'd rather be dancing. So Mr. Bingley is trying to encourage Mr. Darcy to come join the group to try to dance. Mr. Bingley says, "Come, Darcy, I must have you dance." Mr. Darcy says, "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner." Mr. Bingley goes on to try to compel Mr. Darcy in the following way. Bingley says, I have never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening. There are several of them, you see, uncommonly pretty. Mr. Darcy says, you are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room. And Mr. Bingley says, oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty and I dare say very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you. Mr. Darcy says, which do you mean? And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till, catching her eye, he withdrew his own, and coldly said, she is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. And I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. So it's clear that Mr. Darcy understands what Mr. Bingley is trying to get him to do. He's trying to get him to help out the situation and be generous to the women who want to be dancing but don't have a partner at the moment. He understands that. Moreover, he's actually saying this in earshot of Elizabeth. Like, Elizabeth overhears this conversation that we just went through. So he knows that she can hear him, and he looked at her. So by turning around and looking at her, he was sort of conveying that he was at least perhaps partially open to joining the fray. But then he looks at her and his judgment comes that she is not worth him, breaking his bad mood at the moment. Because of course, humor, he's in no humor. This is about his mood at the moment. He's in a particularly standoffish mood, and that's affecting the way he's interacting in the situation. Now, in case you're jumping in for Mr. Darcy's defense, defending him, saying he's completely innocent, I want to show you a passage here that says he's not completely innocent, and he's not even innocent of this charge that he's judging other people. Because of course that's the whole thing, is they're interpreting his shyness as judgmentalism toward them. But we actually find out very soon that he does judge Elizabeth the next few days after this interaction. So let's read the passage. Mr. Darcy had looked at Elizabeth without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. So he is criticizing her. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in his face than he began to find that it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression in her eyes. We see in that passage that he's actually not just criticizing Elizabeth internally, but he's criticizing her appearance to his friends. So he is judging her. Like, there is some truth that he is looking down his nose. Now, a next sentence in this same scene sort of shows how shy people generally try to warm themselves up to a social situation. Oftentimes, it's not by directly inserting themselves and interacting with people, but rather it's by watching from a bit of a distance, sort of assessing the situation, getting to know people without first having to interact. So that's actually how Mr. Darcy acquaints himself with Elizabeth. The passage says, he began to wish to know more of Elizabeth, and as a step toward conversing with her himself, attended to her conversation with others. So he's holding back, observing her, listening to her conversations. This is how he's warming himself up to getting to know Elizabeth. Now, the last little passage I would like to go through on this point is going to be the scene later in the book after Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth have started to get to know each other. And the conversation turns to this initial ball, where they're remembering back to the way they first met each other. And Elizabeth essentially criticizes him for his unwillingness to dance with people and to engage with the townspeople. This is what Mr. Darcy says. I certainly have not the talent which some people possess of conversing easily with those I have never seen before. I cannot catch their tone of conversation or appear interested in their concerns, as I often see done. And Elizabeth, of course, is sitting at the piano. She's just finished playing a little bit, and her response to that is, my fingers do not move over this instrument in the masterly manner which I see so many women's do. But then I have always supposed it to be my own fault, because I would not take the trouble of practicing. And that's her critique, which I've mentioned before, but I want to add one extra point on this, which is about taste. So elsewhere in Jane Austen's book, she associates piano and learning the piano not only with building skill, but also with building taste. And we do find that oftentimes when we first start to play the piano or play an instrument or learn a sport, we don't fully appreciate the experience of those things until we've been at it for a while. Like, we're not just developing skill, we're developing a delight. We're developing an appreciation. And I would actually say Jane Austen books are books that you really have to develop a taste for. Like, the first time you read it, some people will be turned off by the type of language she uses. It's not natural. You kind of have to learn how to get into a Jane Austen book. But once you start to develop that taste, it gets better and better and better. And the same thing is true of sort of these social graces with people, that as you practice, as you build skill in it, you learn to actually appreciate the give and the take of the social graces, where you're conveying to people that you appreciate them. And you come to actually appreciate them in a way that's genuine through that process. Unless you're Mr. Collins, of course. He's actually still more into the pomp and the process of showing respect rather than the actual people he's supposedly showing respect for. But let's put Mr. Collins aside, because we do see a slight bad attitude in Mr. Darcy, where he sort of is viewing it as you have to pretend to take an interest in people. Like, he's not open to the notion that you could actually learn how to genuinely care for people, learn how to genuinely take an interest through the process of interacting with people. That's not really fully on his radar. But if you do this well, like Mr. Bingley does and like Elizabeth does, then these social graces of showing people due respect, of showing people you're pleased with them, allowing them to please you, that can turn into something that's genuine. Whereas at the very beginning, of course it's not genuine. Like, if you don't know someone, you don't yet appreciate them as a person. And the social graces are kind of meant to smooth over the initial getting to know you period so that you can enter eventually into that authentic period. And the reason Mr. Collins is so over the top and such a comic character is that he seems to appreciate the social graces without the authenticity of expressing the respect that's truly inspired by the other person. And that's what the sweet spot does. So this is just a theme that I think is a delicious theme to explore through Pride and Prejudice. It's my favorite book ever. It's an incredible book. It's one of those books that is different. The first 3 or 4 times you read it, it can be a completely different experience with different interpretations of characters, meanings, and the way they're interacting and their value as characters. And that's just so delicious to realize there's that much depth built into human relationships.